But again, thanks to the Education Department for facilitating today's event. And of course, all the thanks goes to Teresita, who is sitting here with me today as kind of a really wonderful culmination of a conversation that started many years ago. And so as Linnea said, the work that you see in front of you, we installed in spring 2021. If you can imagine, that was during the pandemic, obviously, like height of the pandemic, but also this whole space was still being built at the time. So really, Teresita has the distinction of inaugurating the space and also working with us as we were trying to understand the space, what it could be, its possibilities, and this idea of, what should we put at the center, the core of this building? Not just this building, but this expansion. We are at the literal center of the building, which is, it's this great kind of neoclassical building on a hill. And we really wanted to put something here that was not just, eye-popping and show-stopping, but also really thoughtful and demanded more from us as curators and also, from our public to kind of think a little bit more critically. Of course, that was already in our minds, and then everything, in 2020 happened as it did. The pandemic, an era of change, of protest, of transformation, and in that way, I think bringing Teresita's work here became even more, if not, appropriate, then almost serendipitous, because it really questions, and we'll get into this, what is our identity as America, or perhaps Las Americas, which we'll talk about? Where do we position ourselves in history? And what are cycles of destruction and renewal that have defined the American past and present, and will ultimately, I think no one would argue, continue to define our future? And this work really puts all of that into play in a really interesting and compelling way. But the work you see in front of you is an extension of the original work that I saw back in 2018. And I always like to get a little bit of context as to how a work comes to the museum, because it's one of the questions as a curator I'm asked quite a lot. I'll just give you a little bit of background, and then Teresita will get to tell us all about it. But I first saw the work in spring 2018. You had a show at your gallery in New York, Lehman Mountain. At that point, the work consisted of the continental United States, Alaska, and Hawaii. So we didn't have this kind of expanded map that you see in front of us that also includes the US territories. We did a studio visit almost a year later, and then we kind of started entering into conversations about how to bring the work to Philadelphia. We are very lucky that we had a donor who assisted us with that as a promised gift. It was promised to the museum in fall 2020, and that was around the time that we were thinking, okay, what could actually go in this space? So on one hand, a very long and deep and thoughtful conversation with an artist is always necessary to bring something into the collection, especially something with a scale. But on the other hand, there was this kind of serendipity of like all these things coming together. And I think that for me, that's been a real kind of pleasure point in this process, and kind of working with Teresita and being able to show a work right away, that we are able to promise to the museum is always a wonderful thing. So in 2018, as I mentioned, the work actually has a double date. It's 2017/2020. So I'm wondering, Teresita, to start, if you could tell us a little bit about the original work and how it kind of figured into your practice then, back in 2017, 2018, and why, for this sighting of the work, you decided to expand it to include the US territories, and kind of what your thought process was behind that.
Well, thank you. It's really, it's been such a pleasure to work on this piece and to be the inaugural artist who gets to use this amazing space. And I can't think of a better place to have cited this piece, because the challenge of the space actually prompted me to reimagine the piece. And so the piece, actually, I made it in 2016. Even though it says 2017, that's probably when it was finished. But there was a point right before the election in 2016 where I felt like it was really, there was a kind of urgency and a kind of need for me to not be abstract. And so if you look at works that came right before that, and in general earlier in my practice, there's a lot of information sort of hiding within the abstraction. And it was like just this moment in time where I felt really compelled to just look at these very abstract shapes that make up what we think of as, these boundaries of state lines. And then I showed the piece several times, and each time I would change it a little bit. So sometimes I would show it as just the continental United States. Sometimes I would add Alaska, which is, by the way, really big and really far, and most Americans don't realize that. I also did a version of it that was really important to me. I showed a version of the piece in Texas, and in that iteration, what I did is I made a very huge silhouette of Mexico, and I made it so big that it was bigger than the United States, and it was almost like this ghost image that like kind of overshadowed this. It was literally the same pieces, right? This piece has been very many things. And it was so big, the shape of Mexico in relation to the continental United States, that it started to almost look like constellations or the night sky. And that was very important to me. So when I was invited to do this piece here in Philadelphia, I was especially concerned and thinking about the very deep-seated anti-immigrant sentiment which defines this country, in addition to the anti-blackness and the anti-indigeneity and everything else, because that's really our foundation, and it becomes really important to confront that if we are to have a conversation that is expansive. And so I started to really think about the sort of mythology that we love to romanticize, that's been sold to us as part of, the American project, right? And so it's only in the United States that the word America is used in its singular. In the rest of the Western Hemisphere, it's used in the plural. So if you talk to anyone who's a Spanish speaker, someone from Latin America, Central America, the Caribbean, they would refer to Las Americas. They would say United States. They wouldn't use America to describe the United States. And I don't think it's any better in Spanish, right? So Las Americas is just sort of like, it's just the point, it's slightly more expansive, but it really is just, Spanish is a colonial language as well, right? So it's only slightly better. It still says nothing about this landmass and what it may have been called by indigenous people, Turtle Island. There's lots of iterations, and there's lots of sort of regional names for parts of these land masses that only look this way because of conquest and power and because they've been shaped. And so they live in our imagination as these very iconic shapes. And so when I think of, all of these very, American ideas of freedom, of the founding fathers, of what it means to be in the city of brotherly love, what does it mean to be in the city of brotherly love, which was, founded when indigenous people were being decimated and slavery was legal and legal, so it becomes this way of having lots of conversations around the mutable aspects of land and of place, right? Sometimes when we think of the word landscape, especially in a place like a museum, we have these very passive associations with that because, for the most part, we're informed by the definition of the word landscape by romantic paintings, by these very constructed ideas of, say, the American landscape or the European landscape or ancient landscapes, usually Greco-Roman derivative. And so what I did in this iteration is that I added all of the territories of the United States, which, territories, it's really interesting to follow the language because territories is just, a fancy way of saying colonies, or rather a more passive way, a more sort of like easier to digest way of saying colony. So I added Puerto Rico and the Mariana Islands and Guam and American Samoa and the U.S. Virgin Islands, and all of these little islands that we don't even think of as being part of the United States. And it's like, I felt like it was really important for people to be able to visualize that. You know, images are very powerful. For the most part, the way that maps are designed and, you know, geography in and of itself is a colonial practice, right? There are lots of ways of defining place and land masses and relationships to water. What we call geography is basically a result of colonization, and so it can't be objective, right? The discipline in and of itself was literally created as a way of naming and claiming territories. Yeah, so that's why I got this shape. That's how we got here. And the way I imagine it too, and this is what I love about, you know, for archival reasons, that there's us on video, you know, for perpetuity describing what this piece is about, because this piece has looked lots of different ways.
Yeah.
And when a piece is sold or it enters a museum collection, it sort of has to be fixed in some form that's easy to refer to. And so the colonies were all added, basically. They weren't part of the piece before that. And I hope that they will live with it, but I hope that as the world changes and as, you know, this construct that we think of as geography, which has very fluid lines, changes, that perhaps there are many other iterations of this map that will exist when I'm gone as well.
Absolutely, and I think you went into so many wonderful details there, and I think the addition of the U.S. territories is in itself, on one hand, it's almost a challenge to people who walk in and Americans ourselves, perhaps, you know, to remember that the U.S. is beyond the continent. I mean, half the time Hawaii and Alaska get left out of to the U.S. And there's this kind of reach that the U.S. has that is also quite complex. So when I was researching, you know, what are the U.S. territories? Because I know for myself, I'm not great at geography in general, but the number of the inhabited territories, uninhabited territories, and all of the different statuses that they occupy is really quite fascinating. I encourage everyone to look it up. I'm not going to list them all here, but some are Commonwealth, some have representation in government, some don't. We, as Americans, should be learning about these histories, and some of which are, you know, as you brought up in our conversations around the work, and was one of the things that was really important, was that Puerto Rico itself is the world's oldest colony. It's not the U.S.'s oldest colony, but it's the world's oldest colony. So what does it mean to have a place that has been defined over and over again by by being inhabited by people who are not indigenous to that island? And in addition, in terms of the, you know, I kept asking myself why. You know, America seems pretty big. It seems like we have a lot of space, a lot of room, and of course there's the manifest destiny of it all. But kind of thinking about what the economic drivers are, what the political drivers are, it's really quite a complex, almost like matrices of motivations, of histories. And I think for me, here you've distilled, you know, all of this information into an image. And we did get questions when we first put the work up, oh, is this map geographically accurate? And I would respond, well, it's not actually a map, it's an image. And the image is mining the idea of mapping. But one of the reasons we did it, you know, you don't have the labels of the each individual territory, you know, it's kind of a prompt for you to be curious and to look further into these things. But I wonder if we could unpack that a little bit more in terms of how you think about imagery in terms of the familiar. Obviously, it's clear it is a map of the United States and, you know, upon further investigation of the territories. How do images, maps, landscape, and this kind of relationship to nature, how do these relationships work for you in your work? Because something that I love about your work is that there is this edge of the recognizable. And then there's this free interpretation that you achieve, which is both through sometimes it's through a process of abstraction, sometimes it's a very close and kind of reciprocal relationship between the concept and the subject and the materials that you're using. And how do you balance, you know, the idea of the iconic with kind of the artistic?
Yeah, so I kind of think of it, I don't think of it as a literal map.
Right.
I think of it more as like a kind of psychic map, and as a kind of state of mind. And if anything, it's a map of your mind and of what you think about things and places, and how your mind's eye constructs the idea of place. And so all of us here are products of, you know, very violent colonial histories. Regardless of how we can trace our association, those structures live within us. They shape all of the systems that we partake in, and how we see ourselves, how we see the places that we inhabit, and how we see one another. There's this thing that I think of often, which is that the Apache, the indigenous Apache word for mind is the same as the word for land. And this is a really interesting thing for me, right? This idea that there's no difference between memory and geography, right? We can imagine that, like, there are other ways of thinking of what we think of as geography. So that's the first way that I would answer that, is that the material is also really important. And so this piece is made out of charcoal, and charcoal is basically burned trees. And so each section that you see up there is made from the real landscape, right? It's made from an actual tree that was burned, and the tree was part of the place. So if anything, maybe it's the map of a bunch of trees that have been burned. And so there are these concentric ways of thinking of places within places within places, and it's something that has entertained me in my practice for a long time as a sort of personal query to myself. I refer to it as stacked landscapes, right. This idea that you're always in more than one place simultaneously, and that the narrative that you're told, right, the narrative that you believe, or that's the first thing that you think of, which is, okay, map of the United States, is always hiding lots of other narratives. And so what I try to do in the work is to create these images that both prompt you but sort of challenge you to sort of peel back the layers in your own sort of contrived and distorted understanding of things, right? It's a kind of exercise of wayfinding, of actually finding your own coordinates within the sort of conundrum that's been presented in front of you. So more than the actual object, the real art is actually your kind of grappling and trying to piece together or unravel the thing that you're looking at, you know? And it's that sort of dynamic. That's why I say psychic maps, right? Because it is a kind of orienting yourself, and this understanding that, you know, when you figure out where you are, who you are in relation to a place, it also forces you to relate to other people differently, right? It forces you to understand, you know, who you are in relation to place, but who you are in relation to other people, and who sort of is, you know, in this case, if we take the concept America, less the word and less the identity in any nationalistic way, but if you take like the project of America, right, and you ask yourself who is included in that or who's excluded in that, you will find that it is a highly mutable term. It's a really mutable concept. It's always being shaped and reshaped.
Right. And one of the things I loved about citing the work here at the time of the opening of these new spaces in the museum is that, as I said before, this is the exact center of the building. So on either side, we have new gallery spaces on the floor that you can see through the openings there. On this side, we have our new American art galleries, which tell the story of American colonialism up until 1850. And on this side, we have kind of modern and contemporary galleries. So what better work to kind of talk to both of those aspects, which is one is this deeper history of colonialism and how America was and continues to be shaped and also perceived on one side, and the other side is kind of the contemporary aspect, the contemporary view on looking back on all of the, as you were saying, there's a sense of violence in the work because of the fire and the destruction of the charcoal, which we'll get to in a moment, but also the nature of violence and how it has shaped, our world. And let's get a little bit more into the materiality of it and kind of, I'd love for you to talk also about your experience maybe installing it here and the relationship between the charcoal and the map. You work in so many different materials throughout your larger practice. You've worked with gold, with glass, with ceramic, with mosaics we were talking about earlier. So why charcoal for the maps? Because I should also say this is one of a larger kind of body of work that kind of manifests in these charcoal mappings of different parts of the world, kind of recalling, kind of asking us to think about different histories. So why charcoal?
Well, I mean, at the moment that I made this, it's a very incendiary image, right? It's not a celebratory nationalistic image, right? It's not a, image of the United States, 4th of July. Right. It's the depiction of masses of land that are actually real things, right? They're real fern trees that have been burned, right? And so burning, I burn a lot of things. Burning is a really powerful metaphor for me. I was thinking about a lot of things, not just the fact that like what you're left with is like this mark-making art history tool, right, which is the charcoal, but also the connection to slash and burn techniques. So, we like to imagine, we are taught in school that, the Americas, all of them, were just sort of like this beautiful version, landscape paradise before European contact. All these indigenous people just lived happily floating around for millennia without any changes. And that's, a myth that we've been taught. In fact, indigenous people all throughout what we call the Americas now were really managing land in really sophisticated ways, which means that they were making their own soil, they were burning areas on purpose. Slash burn techniques are still used today in many parts of the world. And it's interesting because like I was like a 70s kid who grew up with those commercials of like Smokey the Bear and only you could prevent forest fires. And even today when we see all these like forest fires happening in California, our association with fire is that it's a bad thing, that it's a destructive thing. And it completely obliterates this other narrative and this very important history of this very same land, which is that how it was managed was precisely by burning it, right? And this idea that not everything was used at once, and so they would burn an area and then let it regenerate for 7 years without touching it, or 10 years or whatever, and they would grow somewhere else. And while that burned area was sort of decomposing and changing, all of the nutrients that were entering the soil were of that decomposing organic biochar, fern trees that would basically make very rich soil. And so, and there's so many other indigenous agricultural practices that were so elaborate and so sophisticated. And so when, first European contact into what is, what we think of now as like South America or even the Caribbean, there were really like very developed ways of managing the land and keeping it sustainable. It wasn't just sort of like wilderness, that's a very American concept that's connected to ideas of manifest destiny and modern, you know, and the map is interesting. The sense of geography is very interesting in this context because in order to create a South, in order to create primitive peoples, in order to create modernity, in order to have a South, you have to have a North. In order to have modernity, you have to have somebody who's primitive, right? And so it isn't that other parts of the world weren't colonized before what we think of as, you know, modern colonization in the Americas, but it's the first time that the entire world was drawn up and labeled and named. Okay, so in order to designate different people who qualified as human and who didn't, you had to divvy everything up and you had to name it all, right? And so this notion that there was nothing here and that indigenous people were just sort of like historyless was the foundation that manifest destiny was built upon, right? It is what the notion of America is built on, is the idea that there was nothing here before except, you know, wild flora and fauna, like just growing naturally.
Right.
So those are some of the things that I was thinking of.
And what role for you does this, so I should say that you also, Teresita, came here, we installed this in a day, basically. We had obviously done a lot of prep. So obviously we have all the pieces of the charcoal on the wall. I think there's 83 pieces, I think our registrar counted, and I think that's the final count. But there's also this really dramatic kind of shadow, this kind of striation that Teresita is helping to put on the wall, which is also made with charcoal.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that a little bit and kind of how that adds to the kind of the charcoal?
Yeah, I
elements?
also allowed your crew to videotape me up on the scaffolding, making all those marks. So I did all the drawing on there, and it was really important for me to do it. When I do that drawing, it is a very cathartic experience for me. It's almost like a kind of performance piece that I do for myself. And it is a way of sort of like purging some of the ideas that I'm talking to you about, right? So there's a sort of almost ritualistic aspect. It's not for the public, it's really just for my own mind. It's the way that I enter the psychic landscape, right? But it has a sort of very active and transformative and redemptive quality for me, which is just even the physical labor, because it takes a long time to do this. I mean, it's a day, but it's a day where I can't move for a week
It's a full
after.
day.
Yeah, it's a very disorienting feeling, especially to do it up high like that on the scaffolding. And I really get into just sort of like the shapes, really creating like this dynamic action that under sort of like, that becomes like the foundation. It's not just the object, it's almost like the object is these burned pieces that in and of their within the burning, it is implied that there was the action of burning, right? Even though you can't see it, what you see is the aftermath. And so I think that the physical sort of act, dynamic act of doing this very elaborate drawing also has that, right? Where like the action is contained in the remaining image, you know, in the sort of like the leftover image, which looks like soot or like something that was like refractory, like left over from an event.
I think one of the things that we work so close with the wall. You were so close to the work, doing the drawing. But as the kind of striations and this kind of shadow-like, specter-like, cloud kind of emerged on the wall, and I was kind of in the space, and I walked up to the middle part of the stairs. I realized that another function of it was that it kind of served to both kind of echo and like shadow the map, but also created a new kind of perception of it, like almost a doubling. So what's really interesting, I encourage, after the talk, if you look at it from there, especially if you take a photo of it from there, it looks almost like a doubled image, and it's actually, it creates almost like a visual parallax with the rest of the map, and especially on the phone, take a picture of the phone. It's a very strange effect. And I think that it gives the map, again, this precarity, you know, it both gives it more presence, but also there's a precarity that kind of underlines it that I think is really quite effective.
Yeah, I was really thinking about, so it's like a phantom. Right?
Yeah.
Like when you think of a phantom limb, right? So it's this residue of everything that doesn't get named.
Yeah.
And, you know, without the drawing, the pieces would look very solid and they would look very geometric. And so what I'm trying to do is to almost diffuse them, almost like turn them into smoke, as a way of pointing to, you know, and the word that I use is specter.
Yeah.
As a way of pointing to the hauntedness that is inherent in what we think of as the United States. It's haunted land. It is land where, you know, the land literally remembers the violence and contains it. And I wanted to just say something else, because usually when we think of land, right, geography is something that's created by whoever wins. Maps are made by whoever the winners are. Maps are the history of power. And within that context of everything getting named and divvied up and made into a hierarchy, one of the practices that was most, I think, damaging that exists sort of in our construction of spaces and in our psyches is this idea of how we separate land from water, right? And so this is a uniquely Western idea, right? It's a uniquely sort of westward expansion kind of idea. The reason why these territories are so valuable is because of all the water around them. And so if you talk to island people, if you talk to people who live in archipelagos, in the Caribbean, in the Mediterranean, in the South Pacific, they do not think that their countries are small, right? They see their countries as big, huge, because they count the water in between the islands, which is something that Americans don't do, right? And so it's a really great way to hide an empire, right? You just, you know, you define dominance by the continental mass as the powerful place. And then you have all these quote unquote tiny little islands spread out, almost invisible, and they're thought of as periphery. Sometimes we use words that have been invented, like third world or global south. These are invented terms. So the word global south, which was invented to replace third world, is a term that was invented by the World Bank as a way of organizing poverty, okay? And there is no global south. This is what I mean when I say that maps live in your imagination. There is no physical place that you can point to that is the global south. Most countries in the global south are actually in the northern hemisphere, and they're also far away from one another, right? It's not like they're congruous in one spot. And so these are the mechanisms that are used to shape our idea of what's powerful and what's dominant and what's periphery. And within that, I'd also like to mention in relation to size that in all of these islands after First World War and the Second World War, throughout all these little islands, the United States has established military bases. And so if you think of like the Marshall Islands, you know, like Bikini Atoll, if you think of Vieques in Puerto Rico, these are the places where weapons have been tested, where bombs have been tested over and over again. So they're almost seen as a kind of no man's land. They're seen as like not within the context of civilization. So they're seen as like almost like island laboratories. And this is why they're so valuable to the United States, even though they would like us to think that they are periphery and insignificant because of their size.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you are curious and read more about the territory, something that's written, which is quite interesting, that speaks to Teresita's point, is that it's not just about the land, that the physical mass land, of course, it gives space for tests, but it is about the miles of ocean around each one of these islands that the U.S., by annexing them as territories, now owns. And that's both about natural resource and about, as you were saying, testing weapons and other things. And it's easy to kind of forget that, you know, on land and then under our feet in the water are so many amazing and natural resources that we are almost trained to kind of forget about, so that this can kind of go a little bit under the, you know, under the wire, a little bit kind of, we're conditioned to kind of deprioritize these spaces as parts of America, because America, I'm using the singular America in terms of the idea of America that we've all been kind of, as Teresita was saying, conditioned to know, because if we were to say, and Puerto Rico is a great example, it's a really great example, because they don't have, they're not, you know, there's a lot of discussion about whether Puerto Rico should become the 51st state. There's a lot, obviously, with all the recent hurricanes there, this kind of strange status that it occupies in this kind of liminal state is both defining of it, you know, if you live in Puerto Rico, but also it enables people on the, in the continental U.S. to see it as other than. Like, isn't this their problem versus our problem? If we were to embrace, empower the inhabited islands of the U.S. territories, a lot of dispelling of this myth would happen. It's a cyclical and it's a cyclical relationship between, as defined by the U.S. powers and global powers found in periphery, that kind of keep us blind to what is actually happening, or perhaps less empathetic to what is happening in these areas. So again, it's something I was thinking about as you were talking, Teresita, thinking about both in the physical action of the adding these kind of charcoal, adding the specter, was this idea of the trace, and kind of tracing that this map and a lot of your work in other works are invitations and kind of leave traces for you to follow as individuals, wherever your kind of sense of consciousness or conscientiousness, I should say, kind of leads you. You kind of pose a trail of thought in addition to an image, in addition to you know, one subject. This opens up so much to really think about. And I think the trace is something that, you know, perhaps can be traced through your practice in a really interesting way. I'm going to ask one more question, then we'll turn it over to the audience. And that question also has to do with a little bit of the trace, which is, how do we think about, I'd love to hear you talk about, as the artist, you know, someone that's kind of put this work out into the world. You know, the work will eventually come to the museum, it's a promised gift. And so I was fascinated when you said you started working on the work in 2016, of course, during that very critical election year. We decided to show the work in 2020, and that's the point where you added the territories, of course, the year of pandemic and protest. How do you feel about the kind of currencies of history, the context in which something like this works, something that's so kind of iconic, but also very questioning? How do you feel about the different ways that the work will be received in the future, given its kind of proximity to questioning kind of where we sit here and the larger kind of U.S. history? It means one thing in 2016, it started meaning another thing in 2020. Inevitably, in kind of future histories, let's say, you know, the icon of the map will be received yet in another way, a new way. And I'm just curious, as an artist, kind of how you think about that, again, a reciprocal relationship between your work and viewers and people that experience it at different times.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I don't know that the work will change, right? That is one possibility, that the work physically can change, but the work changes by, you know, by default, just because everything around it changes. And so, like, you know, I would liken it to like reading a book, right? You can read a book when you're 15, and then you can read it again when you're 30, and then you can read it again when you're 60. I'm not 60 yet, but I'm getting close. And the book can mean something totally different, and the book hasn't changed, right? So your reading of it has changed, and so it's not lost on me that, right, like the container, right? This piece exists right now within a lot of concentric containers. You know, one is the museum itself. You know, two is the city. The city exists within, you know, whatever the Northeast, or, you know, some bigger container that exists within this other container, which is like, say, the country, the United States, as it exists now, right? Because borders change, right? They always change. They continue to change. And so I think that it's important to think of these multiple things with the possibility of changing. I mean, I certainly hope and witness that every museum in the world, but especially in the United States, has changed a whole lot in the last 2 years.
Absolutely.
And even just, I think that those small pivots, right, are really important, because they change the read. And this is, you know, this is what a historical context is, right? History is always understood in the present, you know, and our job as people living in the present is to constantly be imagining different versions of history, right? And that is prompted by everything that's changing. The word specter is a word that I love because it has the same etymology as the word spectator. And so there's this thing that happens too, which is, or at least my intention, right? I'm really interested in that kind of intimacy, especially with the big piece, that each individual viewer experiences, right? Because it's almost like I'm trying to haunt the viewer too, like this idea of like the specter and the spectator are actually become one thing, and they become something in conversation. So the land, the landscape, the idea of place is not just something outside of you as this, you know, fixed vista outside of you. It's also something that lives inside of you, and that is mutable also in the ways that you imagine and internalize its meaning within your own construct, right? And I think that that's, I mean, it's a little bit, I'm being a little bit cryptic, because I think that that is a kind of emotional experience, and it's a very internal, private understanding of place. I think that most of us, or some of us, may have associations like that to places that are emotional sort of binds that we have to maybe our places that we think of as a homeland, or places that we think of as home, whether it be like a neighborhood or a city. My family comes from Cuba, so I have like particular understandings of the Caribbean that are very internalized, like in my cells, right? They're part of like my DNA, they're part of like my own genealogy and history. And so the landscape isn't always just outside of us, right?
Sure.
It's inside of us as well. And all of these things are heavily fueled by what haunts us and how we give meaning to the things that that cause an emotional response in us, you know?
Yeah, that's beautiful. I'll just add to what Teresita said, because, and to your great question, which is that, you know, the title of the work is not ash, it's not charcoal, it's fire. Fire, United States of the Americas. And once a fire has burned through, as we're describing, it makes way for something else. So when I look at this work, it's so much about something that has already happened, yet also asks the question, where do we go from here? And that's what I get. That's something I think about almost every time I pass this work, because it's not just a reflection on past violences or incursions, or kind of where it's a proposal for us to think about what we do with this now kind of regenerated earth after the fire.
Yeah, and I would add to that it's, the piece proposes a very personal and private and internal dialogue.
Yes.
You know, I find sometimes that when we have public conversations about social justice and about what we do, or what are the next steps, like what do we do? When we scale that up to the collective, it becomes like a kind of political abstraction. When it gets taken to sort of that internal dialogue, like the way you think inside of yourself, the way you orient yourself, the way you find yourself in this larger scheme of things, is a much more, it implies a not scaled up version of a solution, right? And so I'm really interested in that internal dialogue that a viewer has. And I go back to the kind of haunting, that way that like, when the image is gone, that it can maybe sort of like, it lives inside of you also as a residue, as a kind of reminder of something. But I'm very interested in that private kind of next step,
Yeah.
right? And I think that only when that happens privately can it be externalized into a more scalable version.
Yeah, and it's amazing to do that in the context of a work that can feel so monumental and then speak so strongly to the individual. And I can say from having work on youth the past year and a half, that's really been the response to individuals, to the public, which is everyone interprets it very differently and carries something very different with them as they walk away from the space. And so I would say, Teresita, that you definitely are leaving us with many specters within the many spectators that have seen the work. We were absolutely delighted to have it here for a year and a half. And, you know, if you know anyone that hasn't seen it, please let them know that they have until it's January 2nd. It'll start coming down. But it's been a really wonderful and I think very profound way to start the dialogue between art and architecture of these new spaces, of bringing people into these new spaces, and for us as a museum to kind of think about our own histories and, again, what comes next. So thank you so much, Teresita.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.